In just 100 days, the world as humanity knew it ceased to exist. One assassination, one ultimatum, one mobilization order, and Europe descended into a catastrophe that would claim 20 million lives. This is the story of how a single summer transformed our entire civilization and how Germany came within 40 kilometers of winning it all. The foundation of today's modern world was laid with World War I. Many of you will remember this period from history classes, but I'm going to explain how this tremendous transformation over 4 years occurred in economic, geopolitical, social, and military terms. But first, I need to tell you how the war started and how Germany's victory of immense magnitude slipped from its grasp. The July Crisis, a world war in 1 month. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and his wife, Duchess Sophie of Hohenberg, by a Serbian terrorist cell on June 28, 1914, during their visit to Sarajevo, sent shockwaves through Europe during summer vacation. The Austrians had sufficient material evidence in their hands to prove Serbian support behind this operation. Serbia at this time was a state riddled with ultra-nationalist factions that had made it policy to incite Serbian populations outside its borders. Austria would bring war plans to the table to eliminate Serbia, which constantly provoked the Serbian population within its own territories, today's Bosnia and Herzegovina, Slovenia, and Croatia. After heated discussions between Berlin and Vienna, the German Foreign Ministry gave Vienna a diplomatic blank check, with the not entirely clear approval of German Emperor Wilhelm II and Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg. This check clearly contained Berlin's full support should Austria undertake military intervention against Serbia. Berlin's calculation was that Germany's unconditional support for Austria would intimidate the Russians. Thus, Austria would crush the Serbs, who would be deprived of Russian support. With the blank check in its pocket, Vienna delivered an ultimatum to Serbia on July 23, consisting of 10 articles with content that would be impossible for any independent state to accept. Moreover, the Serbs were given 48 hours to accept this ultimatum. Up to this point, except for London, none of the great powers had grasped that this affair was headed toward a world war. The British grasped the approaching catastrophe and quickly offered mediation, but it was already too late for everything. On July 24th, Serbia entered a state of military mobilization. Let me explain at this stage how a declaration of mobilization made war inevitable. Mobilization begins with hundreds of thousands of men continuing civilian life being called to arms and immediately dispatched to assembly centers on the borderline. A declaration of mobilization is an asymmetric decision, easy to make but hard to reverse. During this period, a state's failure to declare mobilization against a country that has declared mobilization is equivalent to leaving its borders defenseless against the mobilizing country. For example, Austria's declaration of mobilization means military concentration not only on the Serbian border, but also on this country's borders with Italy and Russia. Surprisingly, the Serbs announced on July 25th that they accepted the ultimatum except for one article. That single unaccepted article contained Austria's demand to investigate the assassination within Serbian borders to the extent and level it desired. The Austrians announced they were severing diplomatic relations with the Serbs. Here, it became apparent how wrong Berlin's blank check decision was. Austria's military mobilization led the Russians to go on military alert on July 25th, which does not mean mobilization. The Russians had not yet declared mobilization to avoid war. While the Russians supported their allies, the Serbs, they were trying not to take steps that would fuel war. Meanwhile, the Germans rejected the British mediation attempt on July 26th. The same day, the French began withdrawing their soldiers from North Africa and dispatching these units to France against a possible German offensive. Serbia's response had satisfied German Emperor Wilhelm II. The emperor had said there is no longer any need for war, but war fever had gripped the German government and German general staff. Immediately after the assassination, at the beginning of July, no political or military leader in Europe foresaw that war would break out. But by the end of July, the German general staff wanted at least the crushing of Serbia. The German foreign ministry, on the chancellor's orders, would remove the texts in which the emperor had expressed that peace was possible and give Vienna the green light to go to war against Serbia. More importantly, the Prussian war minister, Prussia being the most important constituent state of United Germany, the German emperor also being king of Prussia, General Erich von Falkenhayn would imply to Wilhelm II that things were now out of the emperor's control, and that if he attempted peace initiatives, a military coup could place the much more hawkish heir apparent, Prussian Prince Wilhelm II. Meanwhile, the German general staff would also severely rebuke the Austrian chief of general staff, who requested 2 weeks to declare war on Serbia. The German Emperor Wilhelm II had now lost his power over his government and general staff. In 1914, the German emperor's political power was close to the role of presidents in today's semi-presidential regimes in the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America. The prime minister and cabinet are accountable not to parliament, but directly to the emperor or president. On July 26th, the Russians declared partial mobilization on the border with Austria, today's southeastern Poland. The Russian Tsar had not declared mobilization on the German border to avoid war. I must note that the Russian Tsar was taking a very great risk because while Germany's mobilization would be completed in a very short time, I should point out that Russia, due to its cumbersome and backward structure, would be the country to complete its mobilization latest. On July 26th, Austria had completed all its preparations for a rushed war. On July 28th, an Austrian gunboat opened fire on Belgrade from the Danube River. War had begun, but the World War had not yet started. The Russian Tsar and German Emperor were still exchanging telegrams for the war not to begin between the great powers. However, the Russian partial mobilization had now largely made the Great War inevitable. Because the German general staff had begun to pressure Chancellor Bethmann-Hollweg, whom they did not find hawkish enough, Moltke and Falkenhayn insisted to the German chancellor that the moment Russian partial mobilization began, the Schlieffen Plan must be implemented. That is, German armies must enter Belgium and Luxembourg and immediately launch a broad front offensive from there through northern France towards Paris. The German general staff insisted that every passing hour put the Schlieffen Plan at risk. The emperor and chancellor would not be able to resist this intense pressure from the military on the politicals. Britain informed Germany on July 29th that it could not remain neutral if Germany declared war on France and Russia. On July 30th, seeing that German military preparations had reached their final stage, Russia declared full mobilization. This step meant the beginning of military preparations on Germany's weakest point, German Poland, west of today's Warsaw and the East Prussian border. From this point on, it is now impossible to stop the World War, because the Germans must deliver the killing blow to France before Russian mobilization is complete. This is their only strategic plan, and this plan has no alternative. On July 31st, Germany would warn Russia to stop mobilization. No response would come from St. Petersburg to Berlin. On August 1st, Germany declared war on Russia. At this point, the German general staff is justified. On this date, France and Germany declared full mobilization. Germany gave France a definitive ultimatum demanding the surrender to Germany of the Verdun, Toul, Epinal, Belfort fortified positions on the France-Germany border, and in return stating that Germany would not declare war on France. These defense systems are the tremendous scale systems that France had built over decades and prepared against Germany. It was very well known by all parties that this ultimatum would not be accepted, that its acceptance was impossible. On August 2nd, the Germans entered Luxembourg under the Schlieffen Plan framework. The Germans gave Belgium an ultimatum demanding permission for the passage of German armies. On August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. German armies began drawing the famous arcs in the Schlieffen Plan. This time, a British ultimatum reached Berlin. Germany was demanded to immediately withdraw its troops from Belgium. It was impossible for Britain to avoid war at this stage. Germany had the capacity to easily defeat Russia and France, and Germany's complete victory meant the control of Europe by a power much more dangerous than Napoleon. Moreover, the Belgian naval bases and ports being in German hands posed a very great danger to Britain. On the night of August 4th, everyone was excitedly waiting for Germany's response. Trafalgar Square in London was packed. Crowds were singing marches. Just then, British Foreign Secretary Sir Edward Grey would utter these unforgettable and poignant words: "The lamps are going out all over Europe at midnight, and we shall not see them lit again in our lifetime." When Big Ben struck 2300 hours, it was 2400 hours in Berlin. No response had come from Berlin, and Britain had entered the war. Let me express the real irony here. The Great War's arrival at the inevitable point first occurred when two great powers, Austria and Russia, mutually put their armies on alert. After World War I began, Austria and Russia were still not at war. On August 6th, following stern messages from Berlin to Vienna, Austria would declare war on Russia. And Germany rolls all the dice, the Schlieffen Plan. When the Great War began, there was tremendous enthusiasm throughout Europe. People gathered in squares, young men volunteered for military service, streets were impassable due to marching crowds. All sides thought the war would be over at Christmas, that is, 4 months later. The war would not end at Christmas 1914. The vast majority of millions of young men who volunteered with enthusiasm would not even see Christmas 1915. Germany, in an age without computers, with very few internal combustion engine vehicles, where soldiers were transported by train, where operations centered on railways and armies began marching where the railways ended, where a soldier carried approximately 30 kilograms of load, Germany had created an extraordinary plan to capture Paris within 6 weeks by moving hundreds of thousands of soldiers over hundreds of miles of distance, the Schlieffen Plan. According to this plan, railways, bridges, logistics centers, and the movement of units down to company level were planned. The plan contained many risks. The Eastern Front was left quite weak. If the Russians mobilized, East Prussia and German Poland were almost defenseless. The plan was sensitive to deviations not just in terms of days, but even hours. More importantly, since the right wing forming Germany's striking force would pass through neutral Belgium in the Schlieffen Plan, it was calculated that Britain would also enter the war. The German left wing located on the France-Germany border was deliberately kept weak. Thus, the French were encouraged to make a successful offensive into German territory. The plan was written with tremendous intelligence. If the French attacked the German left wing, the German right wing would act like a revolving door. After Paris fell, German armies would suddenly turn east, come from behind, and strike and annihilate the French who had crossed the border, just like an anvil and hammer. The axis of the revolving door was fixed to the Ardennes forests on the Luxembourg border. You see the original 1905 Schlieffen Plan. You see that the outermost arc passes over Holland and turns east from the southwest of Paris. The power balance between the right wing and left wing is 85% to 15%. You can analyze what kind of trap the encouragement of the French offensive is, the revolving door. If the Schlieffen Plan succeeded, the German Empire would gain, with its victory, acquisition that would reach the economic power of the United States as the sole great power dominating Europe. However, when the war began, the plan's founder, Prince Alfred von Schlieffen, was not alive. His last words, reportedly spoken on his deathbed a year earlier, were "Keep the right wing strong." His successor, Helmut Johannes Ludwig von Moltke, was not of the caliber of his uncle, the famous Prussian Marshal Helmut Karl Bernhard Graf von Moltke. or Alfred von Schlieffen. When Moltke was left alone with the plan, he would act emotionally, shifting power from the German right wing to the German left wing, and worse still, taking certain units from the right wing and dispatching them east. The reason for the emotionality is the thought that Germany's eastern regions, especially East Prussia and German Poland, were being left defenseless. According to the new plan, the Germans striking right wing on the Western Front was still very strong. But this time, due to the units taken from here, the shape of the operation would also be changed. While the outermost arc would pass over Holland, this arc would be turned more inward. Holland's neutrality would be preserved, but the outermost arc would come to the east of Paris instead of closing over the city west of Paris. You see how Moltke played with the strategic plan. The power balance of the German right wing and left wing is 70-30. The westernmost arc coming through Brussels had begun to close east of Paris. However, this too is a mistake. If this arc had started from further north over Holland, the Germans would have reached Paris earlier without dealing with a large city like Brussels. But the essential problem is that even if the arcs have moved closer together, there is no German unit to cover the gap between the First German Army and Second German Army. This is also the result of weakening the right wing. This revision would cost Germany the opportunity to become a power on the US scale. Later, even when Hitler ruled a tremendous area from the outskirts of Moscow to the Spanish border with the victories he would win between 1939 and 1941 in World War II, Germany would not even approach the relative power it could have achieved in the August-September 1914 period. When German armies rapidly began operations according to the revised Schlieffen Plan, they entered northern France by crushing Belgium. The French counterattacks revealed the true power of a new weapon, the machine gun. While the French suffered terrible losses in their counterattacks, they had also crossed the border and tried to force the German left wing. However, according to the original German plan, the French stationed at the border should have been unable to catch up with the offensive toward Paris with the arcs drawn by the main striking force through Belgium while pushing the German defense and entering German territory. When the German left wing on the Germany-France border was unnecessarily kept strong, the prepared trap did not work completely either. Meanwhile, the Russians' First and Second Armies had entered East Prussia in mid-August. What Moltke feared had happened. Königsberg, the capital of East Prussia, had come under direct threat. Moltke immediately withdrew 2 corps from the Western Front striking force and sent them east. This was a very big mistake. The Germans would devastate the Russians at the Battle of Tannenberg on August 26th and annihilate 2 Russian armies, but the price of this victory would be very heavy for the Germans. Note that the Russians had pushed 2 powerful armies into East Prussia, disconnected from each other. The Germans had annihilated Samsonov's army first, then Rennenkampf's army rushing to help separately. The correct strategy for the Russians would have been to bypass Königsberg, which had a tremendous defense system, and crush the German units east of the Vistula River with the river between themselves and them. Thus, West Prussia and Silesia would come under direct threat, and I note that Silesia was Germany's second largest industrial region. The German right wing was about to reach Paris as anticipated in early September 1914. Approximately 750,000 German soldiers had reached the Marne River, 40 kilometers from Paris. On September 2, 1914, the French government left Paris. Paris was declared a military camp. If the Germans reached Paris, bridges and government buildings would be blown up. While the British Expeditionary Force sent to protect France was thinking of withdrawing from its positions and retreating to English Channel ports for evacuation, thinking the situation was hopeless, French Chief of General Staff Joseph Joffre personally went to the British headquarters and practically begged British Expeditionary Force Commander General John French to ensure the British did not abandon their positions east of Paris. As the German armies were drawing arcs to descend on Paris, coordination between them was decreasing while the gap between them was increasing. The opening of the gap between German armies had much to do with the First Army commander taking initiative and going after French armies he thought were broken. Note the tremendous gap between the German First and Second Armies that had approached Paris. While the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, and French Fifth Army enter the gap between them, the Paris garrison, including French soldiers transported by taxis from Paris, also attacks the flank of the First German Army. No maneuvers are made around any large city except in complete siege operations. The Russians made the same mistake around Kiev in the first weeks of the Ukraine-Russia war in 2022. When the French-British offensive planned by Joffre was realized in the gap that opened between the German First Army and neighboring German Second Army in the Arc, the fate of the war and the world changed. German armies began retreating to meet this offensive and ensure coordination between them. The broken German front would retreat approximately 65 kilometers and withdraw to the Aisne River and dig trenches. When the French also dug trenches opposite them, the trench warfare that would last 4 years would begin. The First Battle of the Marne is perhaps the most important battle of the entire 20th century, at least as important as the 1941 Moscow Battle and the 1942 Battle of Stalingrad. Germany had failed to deliver the killing blow to its enemies and had fallen into the two-front war trap it had always feared most, with the British Empire, France, and Russia. Moreover, Germany was not economically prepared for a long-term war. The British Empire, with the world's most powerful navy, with its fleet consisting of new-type dreadnought battleships, had blockaded Germany. The German High Seas Fleet was not in a position to deal with such a force and lift the blockade established against Germany in the North Sea. Germany would now shift to strategic defense on the Western Front. While the Germans shifted to strategic offensive on the Eastern Front, they would seek a new ally to divide the Russian army's strength and reduce pressure on Austria. This ally was actually at their fingertips. Enver Pasha, who had come to lead the state when he was a young officer, was very eager to virtually put the entire remaining balance of the now collapsed Ottoman Empire on a gambling table. Enver Pasha was a young general, but didn't understand much about military, economic, and geopolitical grand strategy. 2 months after the First Battle of the Marne, Germany would bring its new ally into the war to divide the Russian strength. Turkish soldiers would begin to pay the price of Enver Pasha's gamble with their lives at the end of 1914 in -40-degree cold at Sarıkamış, and at the beginning of 1915 in front of the well-fortified Suez Canal after crossing the Sinai Desert without proper equipment during the canal operation. Turkish soldiers would later pay the price of Enver Pasha's gamble at Gallipoli in eastern Anatolia, on the Palestine front, on the Iraq front, in Hijaz, and in the Caucasus. Germany came within 40 kilometers of Paris, just 40 kilometers from total victory and becoming the world's dominant superpower. But fate turned on the Marne River in September 1914. What followed would be 4 years of unimaginable carnage in the trenches. If you want to understand how this war reshaped our modern world, stay tuned for the next episode.